welcome all of you. And I'm very pleased actually with today's turnout. I'm going to be speaking about the project in a way as a whole. And when I say in a way, all I can really do is be a kind of intellectual tease in this regard, because the topic is so huge. There's really nothing substantive I can say about the whole project or even my own work in this short period, which is why I'm now engaged in a rather lengthy book-length project at this point. Okay, so why would I do this? Before I go into that, perhaps the next slide, Gemma. I want to emphasize how much of a collaborative effort this whole project is. The two lead women, Sheila Humphreys and Catherine Gallagher, have been essential. I mean, obviously they were essential as chairs, but much more than that, they have prodded people and departments into producing histories where no history had existed before. Both of them have been indefatigable in their efforts to make this project a substantial contribution. I'd also like to thank all of the authors, because we probably have, I don't know, maybe 60 people who have never contributed to anything connected with CSHE or any other campus project. And among those are some very, very bright students who worked either as research apprentices for some of us, or who wrote things in their classes, or in one case, completely on her own back because she was interested. Clearly, too, the California Digital Archive staff are already playing a role and will play a larger role when this material is all processed. My personal thanks to the graduate dean, because she gave me all of the data from the graduate division on all of the PhDs and put no limitations on how I could use it. So since I'm going to be working right up to the present, the next person, Natalia Ramirez, turned all of that data into spiffy tables showing the presence and absence of women compared to men in all the departments of the university since the beginning. The beginning data actually came from me. I went through the whole PhD database to extract the women up until 1969, and Natalia put it all together. And then, of course, I'd like to thank the Center for Studies in Higher Education that have not just hosted me, but many of the activities related to this project, including a work study. Okay, the next, if we could have it. One of the sad facts, despite the fact that we're a distinguished university, a major creator of the modern state of California, not to mention educating its population, both at the secondary level as well as the university level, there is no real comprehensive history written of the institution. I consider this tragic, because this institution is so significant in the entire history of the state. There are some. The Ferrier book, very well researched and documented, from 1930, but he only mentions women when Josephine Lindley and Rosa Schreibner enroll in 1870. And there's a short page on them, and that's the first and last time he mentions women. The Vern Stadman Centennial Record of the University of California covers the entire university, so the pages on Berkeley are rather perfunctory and more in the order of short abstracts about history. So that's not really good enough. Incidental histories of departments. These are the existing ones. Bruford was the chair of the physics department. wrote an absolutely magnificent history of that department. Calvin Moore was a chair of the math department, also wrote a very useful history, but women were not his focus. And then in the 20th century, many other things, but it's not specifically about the history of the university. The ones I want to really mention, which were animated by Carol Brentano and Sheldon Rothblatt, are the only specific publications about women up till now. And they were in a series of publications also published by us, the Center for Studies in Higher Education. There was a series of these chronicles of the University of California, and may be seen. The image is perhaps less important than the content, because these are the only essays that deal with particular staff women, with women athletics, and various other topics which actually were not covered in the new round of the 150. And the other is the second series of the chapters in the history of the University of California, written by Geraldine Clifford, who was a professor at the School of Education, who discusses the relationship of training women in the liberal arts, largely, but not exclusively, to become high school teachers, and how the teachers in California shaped the admission standards, to make it terribly simplistic, because it's just worthy of a talk all by itself. Okay, the next slide, please. Writing in this early period is actually something of a headache, because absolutely nothing is fixed. The idea of the research university is becoming very attractive. The history of that adaptation throughout the institutions in the United States up until now tend to be rather stuffily dominated by Yale, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins. And there is no good history of land-grant universities like Wisconsin, which not only graduated large numbers of PhDs before 1900, graduated a lot of women, but the idea of the research university is essential to understanding women graduate students, because obviously you need a faculty, research facilities, and many other things to train them. At this time, there was a great deal of growth, and I would say also death, of some institutions, but they started to sprout up all over the country. So they also, particularly for the land grants, were identified with particular needs of the states in which they were found. In this period too, science is rising as a theoretical and practical significance, which may sound surprising, but the two schools of science, the Sheffield School at Yale, and I'm blanking on the school at Harvard, were only founded as separate institutions in the 1850s. And I think the Sheffield School only joined Yale in the 1860s, late 60s. The curriculum was changing up till around this time, and including Berkeley into the 1890s. Candidates for liberal arts needed to come in with Greek and Latin and would be tested on it for their admission. Also, there were more colleges for women founded particularly in the late 1870s and onward, and more women were going to colleges because they could go at land-grant institutions. The big problem as a historian is higher education in 1870 was a real mess. There's no other way to put it. There were no standards for anything. There was no structure for what is a bachelor's degree. And faculty were, at this point in the 1870s, sometimes actually self-taught and developed amateurs. They were not yet professionalized, and very few, including the 11 professors that initiated Berkeley, had PhDs. So that was a thing which developed in this period that I'm going to be discussing. And then by 1919, All of this had been resolved in the sense that there were agreed upon standards about what constituted a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a Ph.D. Faculty were professionalized. The Carnegie Commission had come into existence. There had been outbursting of professional societies, which created the conditions for publication and the increasingly narrow specification of fields which those societies enabled. And then also the issue of work conditions for faculty were addressed to some extent in this period. So if we could have the next one. No one has been so rash as to try and deal with this vast complexity. However, Kathy Gallagher needs to be acknowledged as the person who has created what we call the framing of the 150W project in a book-length essay or series of essays where she looks at watershed moments, which is a great way of picking out the decisive elements affecting women. So she is going to be first in our archive because of that shaded capacity. Karen Merritt, who you'll be hearing from, who went into great depth about the first women PhDs, who they were, where they came from, their faculty relationships, very, very helpful. Sheila Humphreys not only chased up basically everybody who was lagging in their contribution and stimulated many more, she also wrote several pieces herself on zoologists, women astronomers. This is her piece on women botanists. She also wrote on women in engineering and computer science in the more modern period, and has single-handedly gathered a wealth of information. And as I indicated in my acknowledgements, there are so many authors who deal with the huge variety of life on this campus from the beginning until now. If I can have this slide. So why would I use this as the basis for writing a university history? I don't think the history of women can be separated from the concept of the university, particularly graduate women. And the university as an institution set many parameters which closely affected, absolutely affected, women's participation. They may have been admitted in 1870 on equal terms, but that's really a pretty fluffy kind of statement, because in many respects, women were excluded from important campus activities, including universal male military training, which does not get discussed at all, I find, in most of the histories of this institution. Every enrolled man had to be enrolled in the cadets. It was serious enough that in the summertime, they had more extensive training than the 2 hours of theory and the several hours of physical training they had during the week. When the Spanish-American War broke out, 2 Berkeley alumni were killed in that war because they were mustered for the Pacific. Obviously, women were not part of the military, and military, as we know, members of it are pretty clubby and exclusive without the issue of gender. Also affecting the potential for women was the idea of the university versus that of an agricultural mechanical arts college. The trick that the University of California pulled off was it was able to remain a university despite the bitter conflict of the 1870s, and yet it met the needs of the state through its agriculture, engineering, and all the other departments it developed, which served directly the population of the state. As a university too, high academic standards. The university set those. It had a problem because in 1870 there were, I think maybe there were 16 high schools in the entire state of California. So getting students who were actually university material was something of a challenge, which is why the previous College of California was also rather like a high school. And at one point in desperation, the legislature enacted a decree that any person of education could act as an official instructor anywhere in the state to prepare students for admission to the university, which was pretty amazing. The institution was flexible, it had to be, and yet while it adapted to the conditions of the state, the financing of it and everything else, it had this firm, clear idea about what it was about, its mission, and where it was going. And in a way, rather like the image on the seal of California, kind of like, gosh, why would I blank on her name at this point? From the Athena from the forehead of Zeus, because Athena is on the Great Seal. The University of California, rather like the state, was created by law, and then it was there. And full institutional structure. I find this quite amazing. And then, given what was going on in the world and in the United States, and certainly with the state, the University of California was the inevitable agent given its standards and its mission. And also, of course, since it was a monopoly on higher education, its alumni became the legislators, the judges, the doctors, the dentists, all the professional people of the state, and even a governor or two. If I can have the next slide. Using women seems to be important to me because one, I don't think it's ever been done before, which always appeals to me. But the other is that it gives a focus. Whereas if you just try and write a history of a university, generally, what line are you going to follow? But if you're tracing the women and everything is perceived in relation to that, you have a way of developing your narrative. I also think it's very important. One would think, given the traditional histories of universities, it was all about the great white men who created them. And this is just total rubbish. But it's a trope that has to be fought against. And that's another reason why I want to elevate the activities of women, because eventually it was women's endowments, women who are exterior to the university, like Phoebe Hearst and many others, who made the research university possible through their donations, their gifts, their opening up their houses, supporting women and men. Women played a very important role. Also, there is some issue about how, to what extent women could be included in the campus. And I will look at that in terms of data in a couple of slides further on. But also, for there to be graduate women of any potential, they had to be in an environment where they're being taught by distinguished faculty. So their presence and the development of the Ph.D. research mission are all interactive. Okay, I rather address the last point. As a way of beginning, if I have the next slide. One of the important things for graduate women was what I call the women's sphere, which is a slightly ironic use of a term that was used at this time because the woman's sphere was at home with children. And it was expected that they would not be ambitious, educated, etc. So I'm using it in this way in a very different meaning, because all of the women on campus probably knew each other pretty well. There were so few of them in the first 30 years. And it didn't matter a lot if they were undergraduate or graduate, because many of the graduate women were in fact former undergraduates, alumna of the university. But because of their small number, all of their organizations were for all of the women, not a separation from undergraduate or graduate. A very significant point about the inclusion or exclusion of women is for a student to have standing, that student had to be a member of a class, which meant fully matriculated and resident on the campus. The class structure was tremendously significant. One was literally a freshman, a sophomore, the class of 81, 2, or 3, and that's how you were referred to. They were identified by ridiculous hats and walking sticks. Also strange initiation services, which women were generally not a part of. But from the higher education point of view, the only students who really counted in terms of building the institution were those who were matriculated and earned degrees. Because in the end, what matters is how many people did the university graduate and what were they then enabled to go on and do. So this, as we'll see when we get to the data, raises a number of questions. It's obvious too that the small number of women in this really not much more than a puddle of men, not a sea in these early years. Nonetheless, not only could they not join the cadets if they had any desire, the fraternities started actually in the 1860s when it was still the College of California. The sports clubs, women were not even part of the Glee Club, which is insane. They had to start their own in the 1880s because the men wouldn't let them in. So that led to the formation of women's clubs. But what's very interesting is all of the organizations that were of greatest significance for early women were national. The first sorority was a national sorority, which had been founded in 1870. I'm sorry, I've forgotten its name. I tend to get confused. Anyway, it's in the published material. And it was started at Berkeley 10 years later. Young Women's Christian Association played an absolute essential role in keeping women in college, supporting them, finding work for them, connecting them with respectable women with whom they could lodge, as well as supported their Christianity. Because behind this is the assumption that the students are Christian. And the mission of the university is to preserve a moral environment and to train morally responsible citizens. This is, again, an element which is not all that much discussed. And then in relation also to these national organizations for graduate women, the National Association of Collegiate Women sponsored graduate women and found scholarships, money, books, very important. And then, of course, the actual women who were on campus. Okay, I'm wrapping up since we don't have enough time. Next slide, please. We're nearly there. This was about as clear as I could get this picture. This is the class of 81, I believe, and there are 8 women in this picture. but in the actual roster of graduation, there are only 4 out of a total of 47 students. So this gives you some idea of the relative shortage of women within classes. Also, next slide, please. There is a lot of confusion about who are the ladies because of the way in which data has been maybe a little harsh to say mindlessly taken over, but nobody's ever thought of comparing data sources. And when you do, you see that there were many fewer women than was thought. I mean, they were around, to be sure, but given the absence of local lodgings, most women lived at home, commuted, were not on the campus unless presumably they were there for classes. Women were, however, very enthusiastic participants in external lectures, literally hundreds of women, and women far more than men. Whole families would go, mothers and daughters. So they would be seen in the vicinity, but again, not on campus. And then what I actually have covered to some extent about the issue of matriculated women. So next slide, please. This is a table showing the bachelor's awarded. There is 1891, there is 49 and 5 women. Okay, there were 8 in the picture and there's 4 on the graduate list. So what's true? This is an issue because how are we going to really assess it unless the numbers are right? I mean, that's a small difference, you could say, but if it's accumulated, it does tell a slightly different picture. Good, next slide, please. This is what I have started to do. It doesn't come out too clearly, but using all 3 sources, I'm matching the names to see who actually was enrolled and who actually graduated. And the first matriculated woman was Rosa Scribner, who eventually graduated 3 or 4 years later. These women at large were non-degree students. And at the time, obviously, because women were just admitted, no resident graduates, but they started accumulating in later years. My point simply is it becomes necessary to do this kind of detailed work to get to the real numbers of actual women on campus. Next slide, please. The graduate school and outlying departments. This shows a gratifying persistence and growth of graduate and professional degrees. It also shows the growing number of women in these various categories. The most important for the state was the number of women who earned masters and who went on to teach, most of them went on to teach high school. And then finally, next to the last slide, this is a table that I made about the women, first women PhDs, which Karen went into great depth on. There were a total of 225 PhDs granted by Berkeley by 1919. 200 were men. Women were 11% of that total, which actually is rather high for the time, because in 1900, in the nation, there were only 200 women PhDs. Okay. The person who's done the most work in early PhDs is Margaret Rossiter, and she used the term how women infiltrated graduate studies. Go to the next slide, sorry. And women were very active at Berkeley in the Federation of Graduate Clubs, which eventually resulted in the Berkeley graduate students convening the American Association of Universities under President Wheeler, and resulting in the organization which regulates the top research institutions to this day. you can read the rest of this because I'm running over time. The conclusion is, next slide, please, that an enormous amount of research still needs to be done. A lot has been done, and this project has been a very serious contribution to the history of the campus and its women. And I think this is an important point, but unfortunately, it does not apply universally. It has precipitated something of an interest in departments to write their own history. And then, of course, always as talks tend to end, needs more research. But then the last slide is just a listing of what the 150 project and its continuation will contribute to the campus. And actually, I would say the world of research on universities and women. Thank you very much. And you have 40 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, let me just mention one thing. Those of us who do work on University of California history not only depend on Vern Stadman's centennial history, but he also wrote a history of the University of California, which is not online, and I'm very hopeful that the center is going to put it online before we all get very much older. It's a wonderful match to the centennial history, which is an online document. Is pretty hard to use. My interest in early University of California history comes from the way in which the out of doors figured as an element in and some very interesting historical work has been done on the importance of this out of doors element in the beginning history has essentially created an important University of California role in out of doors organizations, first the Sierra Club and then the National Park Service. When people first came to the new campus in 1873, which is when the first two buildings on campus opened, it was described as a wilderness. One of the advocates of the university being built in the city, e.g. San Francisco, pointed out no schools, no churches, no stores, no sidewalks. On the other hand, the son of University of California's third professor to be hired, who I'm going to mention later on, Joseph LeConte, grew up on the campus. And if you were a child on that campus, you looked out and saw nothing but a wilderness, no rules, no police, no barriers, no boundaries, nothing but a glorious wilderness in which to roam and play. And he ultimately says it was a paradise for boys. So the first students and faculty had everything to create together. I mean, I might have also said no trees, no houses, the nearest places to live and come to the university were Oakland, the village of Temescal, San Francisco, and getting there was an ordeal in the early years. So everything on campus had to be created, curriculum and organizations and the spirit of the campus itself When the campus was occupied in 1873, it was poorly funded. The first curriculum was heavily weighted towards science and math, with the engineering, mining, and agriculture in addition. At first, no money for labs, which meant that field scientists took advantage of outdoor resources. Geology, botany, and zoology outweighed physics and chemistry. By the 1880s, enrollment was still struggling between 200 and 300 students. Anna's already mentioned one of the problems that the faculty faced was a lack of preparatory education, a lack of high schools. And early faculty, many of whom came out of school teaching backgrounds, were heavily involved in promoting the development of high schools, in accrediting curricula that prepared students for the university, and going to teachers' conferences and counseling on how to prepare students for university education. Ph.D. education was launched in 1885 and 1888, when the enrollment was starting to stabilize, heading toward a decade of steady growth in the 1890s. The first PhDs for both men and women were scattershot and one-offs. So the first two for men were chemistry and German. In the early 1890s, civil engineering and mathematics. Then in 1894, 95, and 99, suddenly there were 5 PhDs in geology. How come? The third faculty who was hired by UC, Joseph LeConte, had covered natural history, botany, and geology. That was what he taught. Other faculty in early years also were hired with multiple fields to cover. In 1890, LeConte hired Andrew Larson from Johns Hopkins University, as you heard, one of the leaders in creating graduate education in America, a doctoral education in particular. One of his first PhD, Lawson's first PhD, Charles Palash, who eventually went on to a Harvard career, likened Lawson's coming to campus as a new opening, a new discovery. So they're on the top floor of South Hall looking out, and Lawson asks the students, what's out there in the Berkeley Hills? They don't know. So he says, we're going to have to go out there and take a good close look and make maps. Really the beginning of a kind of professionalization of the field of geology. And leaving the more speculative work to Joseph LeConte. 13 of the first 15 men were in science and mathematics, 2 in humanities. It was not unusual for UC to hire its advanced students, masters, and PhDs as faculty. And that was true of UC's first PhD in botany, Willis Lynn Jepson, whose PhD was conferred in 1848. One other PhD was conferred in that year to Millicent Washburn Shin in the field of education, or pedagogy, as it was called then. As with the UC men, women's choice of fields was haphazard and one-offs until 1910, when the small numbers became a little more regular and began in time to increase. Of the first 15, 10 were in science and mathematics, 4 in social sciences, 1 in pedagogy, and 1 exclusively in the humanities. and 5 of the 15 were in zoology. So how did these women find faculty supervisors? As undergraduate women could have told them, and several of the 15 had been undergraduate women at UC. Undergraduate men could be hostile to women in their classes, and as Anne points out, created publications, clubs, and sports that kept women out. But as Mary Ritter, who you'll meet shortly, wrote, when a woman wants something, she wants it. Read that as when a woman lacks a thing, she desires it. And Mary could have added, she will push to get it. An example of the 10 undergraduate women in the class of graduating in the class of 1884, 8 announced their politics as women's rights. If there's an apt modern motto for the first 15 women who earned their PhDs, it would be, she persisted. An American context for the first 15, as you mentioned, Rossiter's work. Before 1900, there were 228 doctorates conferred on women, and leading fields were pedagogy or education, the classical languages, Latin and Greek, and English. Of UC's first 15, 10 were in the sciences, and only 1 was in English and 1 was in education. So it's a very different profile and says a lot about the predominance of the sciences and mathematics in the opening years of the university. Of UC's first 15, quite a few had been school teachers before beginning their PhDs, and 4, maybe 5, became UC faculty. I had very incomplete information on some of them. All of those 4 retired emeriti, and most of the 15 had UC teaching appointments, usually as assistants. Of the 15, 3 married, and those 3 each had 2 children. It's notable, whatever their doctoral research, and I'll say something shortly about the fields that they received their degrees in, the overwhelming number of them would go into research, government agency work, and volunteer organizations that had a special interest in children and families. Like California's great out of doors, the subjects of children and families were readily available for research, and women pioneered in them. Most of the 15 lived very long lives. I'm going to look at the first 15 as in groups, and I'll start with a lot of this is in the article that I wrote, so I'll pass over this quickly. The first, Millicent Washburn Shinn, had gotten an undergraduate degree at UC and then had gone on to be the editor and writer for the Overland Monthly newspaper, which was a popular and widely read newspaper in California. And then the Department of Pedagogy was created on campus with Elmer Ellsworth Brown as the chair. And he was the one who supervised her PhD in 1898. Her dissertation topic was an observation of her niece in the infant and early years of her life. And she would go on after finishing her doctorate to recruit college-educated women around the country to add to her observations. So she continued her research life after her Ph.D. The second, Jessica Blanche Peshotto, is the subject of a lot of written material and many reasons to be fascinated with her. This was another woman who persisted. Her father was opposed to her going to college. He hired tutors to teach her, but eventually relented. She got her undergraduate degree and then became a student of Bernard Moses, who was another one of the faculty who taught many subjects, poli-sci, economics, and history. And she did a dissertation for him on including travel to France for research on the French Revolution. The time she was in France, she corresponded with Millicent Shin. So there already was some interaction between these first two women. She would go on to become the first woman to be a full professor at UC, the first woman to chair a department, economics, and she created the field of social welfare, essentially. As I say, many of the women moved from whatever their research topic was to an emphasis on women, families, children, that part of sociology. So she was a person who didn't say no. When she saw a young man who was moved up to associate professor, she went to President Benjamin I. Wheeler and said, "You've got to do that for me too," and he did. So again, now the third woman, and I'm going to say more about zoology, was a specialist in zoology and embryology, and undergraduate and graduate student, doctoral student. She did not find a place for herself, though she taught for some years at UC. She wrote to Benjamin I. Wheeler when she left for Wellesley College, where she would become the chair of zoology. "I see no future for my career advancement at the University of California." Wheeler wrote back and said, "Anytime you would like to come back, you would be welcome." And at the end of her life, she indeed did some research with the second chair of zoology at UC. I'm going to just move quickly over these other people before coming back to the zoology group. First woman in mathematics was essentially an adjunct professor. She was one of the three who married and had two children. And in the 30s, the math department, which had used her talents throughout the 20s, off and on, basically dismissed her. She also was the one of this group who died the youngest. Lillian Ruth, maybe Martha has some more information on this. In 1912, Lillian Ruth Matthews got a PhD in economics, and I read a reference to her being a faculty member in the Department of Economics, but I don't know much more about her. A pair of women in the same year, in fact, the same day, received PhDs in astronomy. And they both were students of Armin Leuschner. And I think when you find something like that, especially one who writes praise of one and is writes joint articles with the other, you find someone who was friendly to women who want to go on to PhD work. Emma Phoebe Waterman Haas was also one of the two married. She had strong wish to be a professional astronomer. With marriage, those ambitions ended, except that she was very active as a member of the American Association of Variable Star Observers, which was both professional and amateur, though she was really professional astronomers. And there's an observatory that the family had built in her honor at the Washington, D.C. Air and Space Museum. The other astronomer, Anna Clancy, who published extensively with Armin Leuschner, is the only one of the 15 who didn't go the academic direction. She held many patents as a professional lens designer. The 100% PhD recipient in 1914 was Frances Gillespie in English. Rosalind Wolzer received a PhD in physiology in 1914, and a cohort of hers, 1915, Helen Gilkey received a PhD in botany. The two of them are linked together because they were both professionals at Oregon State University, one a faculty member, the other head of a curator of collections there. Olga Bridgman got the first PhD in psychology in 1912 and 1915. And she was a faculty member at both UC Berkeley and UCSF, and a psychologist in the San Francisco juvenile court. Finally, we got to our let me get down here to another page, to our 5 in zoology. And so how did the 5 in zoology come to get 5 of the first 15 degrees? And here you go to William Ritter, the star attraction, searching for a site that would eventually become Scripps Institution of Oceanography. But my question about why Ritter, why 5 women, with Ritter and his following faculty member, Charles Cofoyd, working hand in glove together. Why them? And you can't answer the question without knowing about Ritter's marriage to Mary Bennett, who was one of the earliest women physicians in San Francisco and Berkeley. Ritter was a school teacher trained in Wisconsin. He read Joseph LeConte's geology book and longed to come to California to study with LeConte. To do so, he came to Fresno, California, and worked as a school teacher to earn money so he could go to the University of California. Mary Bennett set her heart on being a physician over the objections of her family, who thought she was too frail for that kind of an occupation. Her memoir, which I used extensively and I absolutely worth reading, UCSD has it online, More Than Gold in California, gives you such a feel for what those early days at the University of California and in this particular field were like, and for a professional woman. She earned her money by being a school teacher and ended up in Fresno. And that's where she and Ritter met each other. So Ritter earned money to graduate with the class of 1888, and the San Francisco Harvard Club bankrolled him with a scholarship to get a Ph.D. at Harvard. Mary Bennett attended the Cooper Medical School in San Francisco, which was eventually affiliated with Stanford. Stanford took it over as their medical school. And she took over another woman physician's practice in Berkeley. Ritter and Bennett married in 1891, and their honeymoon was in San Diego, where he was finishing his research for his PhD, and Mary was his assistant. In Berkeley, when they settled there, where he chaired zoology, undergraduate women approached her to give them medical exams. Why was that? Because the Harmon Gym, which was exclusively for men, would not admit women into the gym unless they had medical examination. So she did it free of charge. And indeed, the women were admitted at long last to limited hours in the Harmon Gym. And she, with Phoebe Hearst, Regent Phoebe Hearst, was a great supporter of women in the 1890s and beyond. She was paid a regular salary as the University of California's first woman physician. And for all intents and purposes, though she didn't have the title, the reality was she was the first dean of women. Ritter's summer searches for a place for a lab in oceanography took him up and down California, doing research, but looking for a place to locate the lab. Men and women both participated in this research. Both Mary and Charles Cofoyd, the next chair of zoology and director of Scripps, his wife also was a participant. Eventually, Scripps, UW Scripps, what's his name? Anyhow, a magnate in newspapers in San Diego attracted Ritter to establish the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego and then in La Jolla. Edward Willis Scripps was his name. However, what happened to Mary in making the move, as she was expected as a wife to make, she was much involved in helping to plan, especially the living quarters. She acted as a secretary. Scripps insisted that Scripps pay for a secretary to take her place, that was not a way to use your wife. And she gave up her physician's career and her positions at Berkeley, when William Ritter wrote a letter to Berkeley resigning her from those positions. So sounds like a sort of high-handed, male chauvinist exploiter of women, but not so fast. It's more complicated, that story. After Alice Robertson, Edna Earl Watson Bailey in 1910 became the next Ph.D. in zoology, married a physician who had been a Ritter student and had 2 children, but he died untimely. And her relationship with William Ritter throughout was a highly professional relationship. She was co-author with him of his magnum opus, The Unity of the Organism, and many other professional articles. She herself was hired by the School of Education at the University of California and became a strong force on the faculty in the preparation of women for school teaching positions. Another one who retired, Professor Emerita, and much involved in child welfare agencies, as well as preparing teachers at the University of California. The next graduate under William Ritter's tutelage was Myrtle Elizabeth Johnson, who came out of San Diego State when it was a normal school and was a teacher of in San Diego before going into doctoral work. She became the first woman PhD faculty member of what became San Diego State University. We'll get the last 2 here. Rosalind Wolser remained a researcher at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She worked with Charles Kofoid and, I'm sorry, got the wrong person, hang on. Olive Swayze. Olive Swayze was affiliated with Scripps as a researcher and worked jointly with Kofoid on joint publications. The final of the 15 in 1916 was Irene Agnes Mccullough, who took her PhD under Kofoid's tutelage to the University of California, where she found a not very robust marine biology unit attracted the interest of a donor, George Allen Hancock, who created the Hancock Foundation that made the USC marine biology program one of the outstanding ones in the country. And that is the end of my story.
Well, thank you so much, because it really is a perfect compliment. You fill in the actual women as opposed to the theoretical approach. Thanks.